It was the kind of spring morning that made Beechwood Cross look like something out of the Victorian watercolor mist clinging to hedgerows, dew sparkling on the grass like tiny diamonds, and birds singing as if in polite conversation. The village, a scattering of honey-stoned cottages threaded by narrow lanes and encircled by farmland, was dressed for festivity. Today was the much-anticipated spring flower show held every April in the vicarage garden. It was the sort of annual event that blurred the line between friendly competition and bloodless war. The marquee, large and slightly faded, had been erected beside the vicarage's ancient yew trees. Inside, long tables were draped in white cloths, awaiting the villagers' best offerings. Tulips, daffodils, primulas, and pansies had been coaxed into peak form and arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for royalty. But this year, the crocus competition, a category usually overlooked, had drawn unexpected attention. And all because of one dazzlingly perfect specimen. Miss Lavinia Hepplewhite, trim and commanding at 73, had never before entered a crocus. She was known for her prize-winning foxgloves and rigid opinions on compost, but this year she had broken tradition. Her entry, a single purple crocus of such depth and sheen it appeared almost velvet, sat alone in a porcelain pot, its delicate petals open like a secret. It glowed with life, full and defiant in the face of a spring that had been bitter and reluctant. "She always has to show off," whispered Doris Ambles to her neighbor, clutching her handbag like a moral compass. "We all lost ours to the frost, but hers bloomed as if it were July." Mrs. Penelope Cartwright, who once won a county award for her climbing roses and still wore the brooch to prove it, clicked her tongue. "She never plants late, she plans late. Always has an angle, Lavinia. Wouldn't be surprised if she piped hot air under her beds." Miss Marple sat nearby, listening without appearing to. She was sipping tea from a blue china cup, her hat decorated with a modest ribbon, her expression mild. If one looked closely, they might see the light behind her eyes, watchful, gentle, alert. She was not here for trophies. She had brought along a neat collection of hellebore's lovely, nodding flowers in plum and ivory tones, which she had arranged with her characteristic simplicity. "It's a show crocus, not a spring one," muttered Rev. Leonard Cresswell, the local vicar, as he adjusted a folding chair beside Miss Marple. "I dare say she forced it. Bulbs and drawers and all that nonsense." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, watching Miss Hepplewhite preen in a wide-brimmed straw hat. "Though forcing a crocus takes delicacy, especially in this weather. Rather like persuading a stubborn child to recite their lines without tears." The judges were already making their way through the tent. Colonel Dewsbury, broad of chest and mustache, led the trio, flanked by a waspish former headmistress named Miss Prim, and a stout gentleman with rheumy eyes introduced only as Mr. Hargood. They moved with slow solemnity, their clipboards at the ready, nodding gravely and murmuring about symmetry and root condition. When they reached Miss Hepplewhite's crocus, the atmosphere changed. Colonel Dewsbury bent close, monocle in place. "Extraordinary depth of color," he said, "that center almost black." "It's the variety," Lavinia said, trying not to gloat. "I acquired the bulbs from a specialist nursery in Utrecht," Miss Prim sniffed. "Too symmetrical. Some might say artificial." "I dare say nature can be perfect now and again," Lavinia replied smoothly. "Though not often, I grant you." Outside the tent, the villagers moved among stalls selling rock buns, jam jars, and second-hand paperbacks. Children tumbled through daisy-strewn lawns, dogs barked at pigeons, and teapots were emptied and filled again. Miss Marple had just been offered a second scone when the judging concluded. The silver trophy for outstanding specimen, Spring Bloom, was, unsurprisingly, awarded to Miss Hepplewhite. She accepted the honor with a smile that was carefully constructed, part grace, part triumph. A smattering of polite applause followed. "And once again," said the vicar, raising a glass of elderflower cordial, "we are reminded that perseverance and careful cultivation are virtues most rewarding." Miss Marple's smile flickered. "Sometimes," she murmured, "the rewards come too quickly to be quite natural." No one heard her over the renewed clatter of cutlery and praise. It was just after the luncheon queue had begun to thin, and the ladies had returned to fussing over sponge cakes, when a scream split the gentle spring air, sharp, high, desperate. The sound came from the exhibit tent. People turned in alarm. Teacups paused in midair. Children froze mid-laugh. Then came the unmistakable sound of feet running, stumbling, something crashing. Myrtle Cavendish, housekeeper to Miss Hepplewhite for 30-odd years, emerged from the tent like a ghost from a fog. Her apron was askew, her face ghastly white. She stumbled, reaching out blindly before collapsing onto the grass. "She's dead," Myrtle wailed. "Oh, God help us, Miss Hepplewhite is dead." The silence that followed was immense. Then the chaos began. People rushed forward. Colonel Dewsbury bellowed for space. Mrs. Cartwright gasped so violently she had to be seated. Children were herded away. Someone knocked over a pot of lupins. Dr. Fielding, who had been quietly nibbling a jam tart beneath the elder tree, pushed through the crowd, carrying his bag with grim urgency. He was a stout, red-faced man with intelligent eyes and no patience for hysteria. Inside the tent, Miss Hepplewhite lay on her side, one hand clutching the edge of the table. Her hat had fallen askew. The winning crocus sat beside her, untouched, its brilliant petals now mocking. "No pulse," muttered Dr. Fielding, eyes fixed, rigor setting in. "Not a fall, I'd say." Miss Marple, arriving silently at the entrance, stood very still. She did not push to the front or gasp. She watched. A faint, sharp scent lingered in the air. Not the must of damp canvas or potting soil, but something bitter, acrid, almost medicinal. "Poison?" someone whispered. Dr. Fielding nodded slowly. "Could be. I'll confirm at the surgery, of course, but I don't like the smell. She was perfectly well this morning." Inspector Larch arrived 15 minutes later, summoned from Chipping Lacey. He was tall, pale, and carried the air of a man annoyed to be outdoors. He examined the body, made a few notes, and turned to the gathering crowd. "We'll need names of all those who were in or near the tent in the last hour." Miss Marple approached him gently. "If I may, Inspector," she said, "you might consider questioning anyone who handled or stood close to the crocus." Miss Hepplewhite was quite possessive of it, but several people lingered, and she made a point of telling everyone she had imported the bulb. Larch gave her a tight smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I think we can manage." Miss Marple inclined her head and returned to her seat by the tea table, but her eyes never left the marquee, or the single triumphant bloom that now presided over death. Something about it troubled her deeply, not its color or its origin, but the timing. The crocus had bloomed late this year, and now so had something else, something far darker. The body had been removed, and with it most of the gaiety. Yet the vicarage drawing-room, now hastily transformed into a makeshift gathering place. For the shaken villagers was abuzz with the very thing Beechwood Cross did best gossip. Rain had begun to fall gently outside, tapping against the windows like fingers on a tabletop. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, over-steeped tea, and nervous speculation. "She was fine not 2 hours ago," whispered Penelope. Cartwright, dabbing at her temples with a lace-edged handkerchief, smiling, laughing well, in her own way. "Not the sort to drop dead on a crocus." "It wasn't the crocus," said Doris Ambles grimly, her voice pitched just high enough for everyone to hear. "It was foul play, you mark my words." Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting in her lap, untouched. She had listened to nearly half an hour of theories, each more confident than the last, none more accurate than the next. "I heard she argued with Mr. Hargood before the judging," said Mr. Peebles, who ran the post office and rarely got names right. "Something about mislabeling the tulip section." "Nonsense," said Penelope. "He was complimenting her. I heard it myself. Besides, she ought to try dahlias next year." "Well, he looked cross," Peebles insisted. "One can be both." Flattering and furious. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the group, her blue eyes soft but alert. "I wonder," she said gently, if anyone happened to see Miss Hepplewhite eat or drink anything just before she collapsed. There was a pause. The group looked among themselves, shaking heads slowly. She had a slice of seed cake, I think, offered Mrs. Grimble, the baker's sister. From my stall, I'm quite sure. Though I hardly think one slice, and tea, added Doris, from the green urn, not the brown. That doesn't help, said Penelope, exasperated. We all drank from the green urn. Unless we're all dying, I think we can eliminate the Earl Grey. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. No, not poisoned in the usual way, I think, though there was a rather distinct odor in the tent. Bitter, quite unlike the usual flower tent smells. The room fell silent for a beat. Rain struck harder against the windows now, and somewhere in the kitchen, crockery clattered. I thought it smelled like liniment, said Mr. Peebles, sniffing. My wife rubs something similar on her shoulder when the cold sets in. Camphor, perhaps? Miss Marple mused aloud. Or oil of bitter almonds, maybe, though that tends to be sharper. More insistent. Are you suggesting she was poisoned? Penelope's voice dropped to a whisper. I am only observing that Miss Hepplewhite did not appear to die naturally, Miss Marple said mildly, picking up her needles again but not knitting. She was in full health, looked rather flushed in fact, and then suddenly gone, like a petal falling. Before anyone could reply, the door creaked open and Reverend Cresswell entered, his spectacles askew and his hair damp. Inspector Larch has begun his inquiries, he announced in his quiet, precise tone. He's interviewing those who were nearest the exhibit tent in the last hour before. Well, did anyone see her touch the flower? Miss Marple asked without lifting her eyes from her yarn. Cresswell frowned. Touch it? Well, yes, I think she adjusted the pot at one point, lifted it slightly. Wiped something from the saucer. Indeed, murmured Miss Marple, her fingers still. That would do. Do what, Jane? Penelope asked suspiciously. Miss Marple gave a thin smile. Why, nothing, my dear, nothing at all. I was simply thinking of how very dangerous spring can be. One forgets how many plants are quite deadly if handled improperly. Monkshood, foxglove, even crocuses. Under certain circumstances? Surely not a flower, said Doris. No one dies from crocus sniffing. Not sniffing, Miss Marple corrected gently. But there are other ways. Some varieties, particularly those not of the spring-blooming type, are potent. Reverend Cresswell cleared his throat uneasily. The inspector is examining the plant now, along with the pot, the table covering, and her gloves. And who's he suspecting? Asked Mr. Peebles, always eager for inside knowledge. Someone must have done it. I heard she kept poison for slugs. Maybe someone slipped it in. Her drink. Cresswell looked uncomfortable. It's too soon to say, though I imagine the inspector will start by speaking with her household staff. That brought a murmur. Myrtle Cavendish had worked for Miss Hepplewhite since the early 1960s. She was loyal, certainly, but reserved and married, childless, a creature of routine and silence. Do you know, said Doris, lowering her voice, I always thought Myrtle was a bit peculiar. She's efficient, Penelope countered, which in this village counts as peculiar, I suppose. She's also the only one with unrestricted access to the house, Miss Marple pointed out, and to the garden and to the bulbs. The thought hung in the air like smoke. But surely she wouldn't, began Penelope. No one ever would, said Miss Marple simply, until they do. At that moment the drawing-room door opened again. Inspector Larch appeared, clipboard in hand, his expression tight. I'll need to speak with a few of you, he said. Individually. We've moved Miss Hepplewhite's belongings to the rectory study for examination. The coroner will arrive shortly. He paused, then looked directly at Miss Marple. I suppose it would be too much to hope that you didn't notice anything useful today, Miss Marple? Her eyes twinkled, though her expression remained modest. Why, Inspector, I noticed everything. But deciding what is useful, that's the real trick. He gave her a long look, then nodded curtly and turned to speak with the vicar. Miss Marple set her knitting down and stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where rain traced winding paths down the glass like invisible fingers. Miss Hepplewhite had been vain, proud, exacting, but she had not deserved to die, not like that. Someone in Beechwood Cross had gone to extraordinary lengths to silence her, and they had chosen to do it not with drama or violence, but with subtlety during the flower show, no less, among bunting and jam tarts. It was not just murder. It was performance. Miss Marple turned back to the room, her eyes scanning the familiar faces. Myrtle Cavendish, Mr. Hargood, Colonel Dewsbury, Doris, Penelope, the vicar, all of them actors in a play they had not chosen, but which one of them had written the script? She would find out. Not by storming about or making accusations, but by watching, waiting, and listening. Because in villages like Beechwood Cross, people didn't hide their secrets with silence. They hid them in conversation. And in gossip, Miss Marple had always found the truth eventually bloomed. The next morning dawned gray and still, with a fine mist hanging low over Beechwood Cross like breath on a mirror. The flower show grounds were deserted now, save for the canvas marquee its edges flapping softly and the faint outline of wilted blossoms leaning into the damp. What had been a celebration of new life now stood silent as a chapel after a funeral. Inside the vicarage kitchen, Miss Marple stirred a pot of porridge with her usual patience, her thoughts far from oats and cinnamon. "Do you know," she said aloud, though only the cat was listening, "I don't believe Miss Hepplewhite intended to win this year." Not really, and yet she did. Tabitha, a sleek gray creature with imperious eyes, twitched her tail but offered no further commentary. Miss Marple carried her breakfast to the sunlit table and opened her post. A short letter from her nephew, Raymond in London, a seed catalogue from Cornwall, and a folded note with the vicarage seal clearly from Reverend Cresswell, who had promised to keep her informed. She read it with a soft then set it aside and reached for the catalogue instead. Seed catalogues, in Miss Marple's mind, were far more revealing than they seemed. Not merely for what people planted, but why they chose certain things. Miss Hepplewhite had been a collector not just of exotic varieties, but of rare ones. Crocus imperati, for instance, was hardly standard garden fare. And while it could be cultivated in England, it required care, heat, and a precise understanding of dormancy. That she had entered one into the spring show, and one suggested either remarkable foresight or an unexpected motive. Miss Marple leaned closer to the page, her eyes narrowing on a particular annotation in the catalogue. C. Imperati. Deep violet. Requires chilling period, rare, toxic if ingested in quantity. She gave a soft ah and folded the paper. Not enough to kill, no, not from casual handling, but if ground perhaps. Or if something else had been hidden in the soil, something to mask the scent. Outside, the bells of St. Bede's told the hour, 10 o'clock. Time for her morning call. She arrived at the Hepplewhite residence on Larkspur Lane shortly after past. The gates were open, though the blinds remained drawn across the upstairs windows. The front garden, usually trimmed within an inch of its life, looked as though no one had touched it since the day of the flower show. Which indeed they hadn't. Myrtle Cavendish opened the door, her eyes red but dry. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, stepping aside. I didn't think you'd come. I thought you might appreciate a visitor," Miss Marple said gently. "Death leaves such a quiet house behind, doesn't it? May I?" "Yes, of course," Myrtle said, leading her to the back sitting room. A small space filled with dark wood, rose-patterned upholstery, and the faint scent of lavender polish. A photograph of Miss Hepplewhite sat on the sideboard, framed in silver, her mouth slightly pursed, her eyes sharp even in stillness. "I made tea," Myrtle offered. "I wasn't sure if I should, but, well, she always had it at 11. "That was kind of you." They sat without speaking for a moment, the silence not yet companionable, but not cold either. "She wasn't easy," Myrtle said eventually, "but she was constant. You know what I mean?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, predictable in her habits." "Exactly," Myrtle said, relieved. "Everything in its place. Tea at 11, garden at 4. She didn't even like flowers brought indoors, said they were meant to be seen where they grew." And yet, said Miss Marple, she brought that crocus inside. Not just into the tent, but onto the judging table. She touched it, didn't she? Myrtle looked startled. Yes. Yes, I think she wiped the saucer. There was a bit of something. White residue. Fertilizer? Miss Marple asked. No, Myrtle said slowly. At least, I don't think so. She said it looked like powdery mildew. But that would have been odd on a new bloom. Miss Marple nodded, more to herself than to Myrtle. Do you know, she said quietly, I always found it fascinating how we remember moments right before death. Not just the big things, but the small ones, the way someone turns a pot, or wipes a leaf, or says a word that sticks strangely. Myrtle swallowed. I've been trying not to remember. Everything I see in this house reminds me of her, the slippers, the cutlery, even that old radio she never listened to but wouldn't part with. Grief is like that, Miss Marple sighed, laying a hand on the woman's wrist. But it also makes us observant, and that can be useful when others are less so. Myrtle hesitated, then lowered her voice. Do you think she was murdered, Miss Marple? I think someone wanted her silenced, Miss Marple replied, softly, and chose a very floral method. Myrtle's eyes widened. But who would? She didn't have enemies, not really. Not openly, Miss Marple agreed. But she had rivals. And grievances. People she embarrassed, snubbed, or perhaps even blackmailed. Myrtle blinked. You think it was someone in the village? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said, taking a sip of her tea. It usually is. Later that afternoon, in the modest reading room of the Beechwood Cross Library, Miss Marple examined the old flower show programs while sipping tepid coffee. Penelope Cartwright spotted her and drifted over, curiosity piqued as always. I thought you'd be out gardening, Jane, she said, plucking a volume off the shelf for show. Not today, Miss Marple replied. Too damp. And besides, I was just refreshing my memory. Penelope leaned in, eyes glinting. About the flower shows? No, did you know Miss Hepplewhite hadn't entered anything last spring? Penelope blinked. Did she not? I thought she always did. Apparently not, nor the year before. That's odd, Penelope said. I wonder why. I suspect something occurred in those years that gave her pause, Miss Marple said, closing the program gently. Or perhaps someone warned her off. Warned her. Oh, not overtly. But gardeners can be terribly territorial. If she'd been accused of cheating... Cheating? Penelope gasped. Lavinia, never. She won more often than not, Miss Marple said gently. That breeds resentment. And resentment in a small village tends to germinate slowly, then bloom suddenly. Penelope looked shaken. Who do you suspect, Jane? Miss Marple gave a small smile. No one and everyone. That is the peculiar thing about gardens and murder. The roots are always hidden, but the leaves will show themselves soon enough. The village of Beechwood Cross was waking slowly from its shock. The previous day's flower show, meant to be a light-hearted celebration of nature's awakening, now lay shrouded in a veil of unease. Miss Hepplewhite's sudden death had unsettled the familiar rhythms of the community as surely as a frost kills the budding rose. Miss Marple sat by the window of the rectory drawing-room, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. The rain had ceased, leaving a dampness in the air that felt as heavy as the unspoken questions hanging between neighbors. Outside, the garden was fresh and glossy, but the sunlight seemed hesitant, as if wary of stirring old ghosts. Reverend Leonard Cresswell was seated opposite her, a pile of notes and a flask of tea at hand. He looked every bit the vicar one imagined, gentle, conscientious, and quietly burdened. I trust the inspector's inquiries are proceeding, Miss Marple ventured. Slowly, he sighed. The villagers are cooperative, but the atmosphere is strained. Fear, suspicion, things we do not often invite here. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. Small communities are like gardens themselves. When one root is rotten, it can affect the whole bed. The door opened gently, and Myrtle Cavendish entered, clutching a small leather-bound notebook. She looked nervous, her pale cheeks flushed. She avoided Miss Marple's gaze as she crossed the room. Good morning, Myrtle, Miss Marple said kindly. Please do sit. Myrtle hesitated, but took the offered chair, smoothing her apron. "I thought you might find this useful," she said, producing the notebook. "It's Miss Lavinia's diary of sorts. She never spoke much about it, but I found it tucked behind a stack of seed catalogs." Miss Marple took the notebook and opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat but cramped, full of botanical observations, schedules for fertilizing, and occasional entries that hinted at personal thoughts. March 10th. The Emperate crocus shows promise, though I suspect one of the bulbs was mishandled during shipping. Miss Marple read aloud. "We'll speak to Hargood about sourcing next year." "Mr. Hargood?" Reverend Cresswell asked. "A local horticulturalist and one of the judges," Miss Marple replied. Man with an interest in rare plants and perhaps more." Myrtle bit her lip. Miss Lavinia trusted no one but me. She never confided in the village, not really. But I think she feared someone might sabotage her. "Sabotage?" Miss Marple mused. "In a flower show?" "Not just the show," Myrtle said quietly. "Her garden was her pride. And she believed someone was jealous." "Jealousy?" the vicar repeated. "That old weed that kills quietly?" Miss Marple nodded. "And sometimes grows in unexpected places. Tell me, Myrtle, have you noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the show? Visitors who stayed too long, strange deliveries, or perhaps disagreements?" Myrtle hesitated again, then shook her head. "There was a man, I didn't know his name. Tall, dark hair, spoke with an accent. Came twice, late at night. Miss Lavinia was angry, but wouldn't say why. She told me to mind the house, but I heard voices." "Voices?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "What sort?" "Arguing," Myrtle whispered. "About money, I think, or secrets. It was hard to tell." "Did you see the man?" the vicar asked gently. "No, only his shadow." "He left before dawn each time." Miss Marple leaned forward. "A visitor under cover of darkness. How curious. Do you think Miss Hepplewhite feared this man?" Myrtle looked down. "Yes, she begged me not to speak of him. Said it could ruin everything." Miss Marple tucked the diary into her lap. "It seems the crocus was not the only thing blooming late this spring." Later that afternoon, at the village tea shop, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Mrs. Penelope Cartwright and Doris Ambles. The three women sat around a small round table, cups of Earl Grey steaming before them. "I hear Myrtle's been quite the talk of the town," Penelope whispered, her eyes darting to the door. "Seems she's hiding something?" "Everyone hides something in Beechwood," Doris replied, fingering her sugar bowl. "I say, the woman is more trouble than a fox in the henhouse." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Trouble often comes with the territory, I find. But sometimes it's the quiet ones who see the most." Penelope snorted. "She looks like she'd spill everything if pressed, or run off with the gardener's boy." "Oh, Penelope," said Miss Marple mildly, "we must be careful not to judge so hastily." Myrtle's loyalty was well known. "Though loyalty can be complicated," Doris raised a brow. "Complicated how?" "Because loyalty can mean protecting someone's secrets, even when those secrets are dangerous." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Hargood, the horticulturalist and judge. His rheumy eyes flicked between the women with thinly veiled suspicion. "Mrs. Cartwright," he said stiffly. "Miss Marple. A pleasure, though these are unfortunate times." He cast a glance around the room, lowering his voice. "I've heard troubling rumors about Miss Hepplewhite's recent dealings. Financial difficulties, some say, and disagreements about plant sourcing." Penelope bristled. "Lavinia managed her affairs meticulously." "Perhaps too meticulously," Hargood countered. "Rumors often have a root in truth." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Mr. Hargood, did you and Miss Hepplewhite have any recent disagreements?" He hesitated, then said, "Disagreements are common in our circles, but nothing beyond professional disputes." "Did she mention anyone visiting late at night?" Miss Marple pressed. Hargood's face tightened. "No one of note." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Sometimes what is of note depends on who is asking." He made no reply, instead excusing himself with a slight bow. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, her mind swirling with Fragment's diary. Entries, shadows at midnight, whispered arguments. She sat by the fire, tea cooling at her side, knitting forgotten. Reverend Cresswell joined her with a fresh pot. "You seem burdened," he observed kindly. "Just sorting through weeds and blossoms," she said. "A garden of human nature is never simple," he smiled gently. "No, it is not. But with patience, even the most tangled roots can be uncovered." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "Someone wanted Miss Hepplewhite silenced," she said softly. "Not for the flowers, not for the trophies, but for something far more personal," the vicar sighed. "And that someone is still among us." She looked up, steady and resolute. "Yes, and I intend to find out who." The morning market in Beechwood Cross was usually a cheerful affair, baskets brimmed with fresh produce. The chatter of villagers mingled with the calls of stallholders, and the scent of warm bread wafted on the breeze. But this morning the atmosphere was taut, charged with the unease that lingered after Miss Hepplewhite's untimely death. Miss Marple, wrapped in her modest tweed coat and a pale green scarf, wandered slowly among the stalls. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, the tight smiles, the lowered voices, the sideways glances that spoke of stories half told. Though the village was small, its secrets were many, and today they lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Mrs. Elsie Wren, who ran the flower stall, greeted Miss Marple with a curt nod. "Morning, Jane," Elsie said, arranging a bunch of tulips with mechanical precision. "Terrible business, that." "Shocking, really." "Yes, it is," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Did you know Miss Hepplewhite well?" "Not well," Elsie replied, "but we all knew of her. A formidable woman, that one. Some might say a bit sharp for our village. She could be difficult." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "Difficult, yes, but also determined. I wonder—" "Elsie, did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the flower show?" Elsie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if the shadows themselves might be listening. "There was talk," she admitted. "Some said Miss Hepplewhite had been having disputes about where she bought her bulbs, that she accused someone of selling her faulty stock." "Did she say who?" Miss Marple pressed. "No one named." "Names openly?" "But there was a rumor that she'd quarreled with Mr. Hargood." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Elsie. That is helpful." Moving on, Miss Marple stopped by the bakery stall, where Mr. Jameson was arranging scones and tarts. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're the first customer today. Can I tempt you with a fruitcake?" "Not just yet," she smiled. "Tell me, Jameson, did you hear any gossip about the show or Miss Hepplewhite?" He chuckled softly. "Beechwood never runs short of gossip. Some say Miss Hepplewhite was too proud. Others say she wasn't as rich as she pretended." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Really? Well, it's village talk, of course. But I've heard she was worried about debts. Maybe that had something to do with the man Myrtle mentioned, the one who came at night." "Interesting," Miss Marple said. "Do you know where he might have come from?" "Not exactly," Jameson said. "But there were whispers about London, and perhaps the city seed auctions. High stakes, that business." Miss Marple's mind pieced together fragments. Rare bulbs, disputes over supplies, a mysterious visitor, all signs of tensions beneath the polite surface. At the far end of the market, Colonel Dewsbury stood talking with a small group. His usual air of command seemed subdued. "Colonel," Miss Marple greeted him, "how are you faring in these difficult times?" The colonel straightened. "As well as one can, Miss Marple." "A murder at a flower show, who would have thought?" "Indeed," she said. "Have you noticed anything unusual in your conversations with fellow judges?" He hesitated, then said, "There were disagreements, yes, about the judging criteria." Penelope Cartwright was particularly vocal. Miss Marple nodded. "Miss Cartwright does have strong opinions." "Too strong," Dewsbury said quietly. "I sometimes wonder if those opinions are rooted in more than just garden aesthetics." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "You suspect motives beyond flowers?" "Possibly," he admitted. "In Beechwood, things are rarely as simple as they seem. Leaving the colonel, Miss Marple wandered back toward the center of the market, where a crowd had gathered around a small notice board. A new posting caught her eye, a call from Inspector Larch asking anyone with information about Miss Hepplewhite's death to come forward. Nearby, Penelope Cartwright spoke in low tones. With Doris Ambles, Miss Marple approached them quietly. "Ladies," she said softly, "have you heard anything that might help the investigation?" Penelope smiled thinly. "Only that everyone is on edge. People are talking, of course, but much is speculation." "And speculation is often the first step toward truth," Miss Marple said. Doris nodded. "I heard that Myrtle Cavendish has been acting oddly since the incident, nervous, jumpy. Some say she's hiding something." Penelope raised a brow. "Myrtle always was peculiar," Miss Marple folded her hands. "Peculiar or not, she may hold the key." Before the women could respond, the village constable hurried over with a message for Miss Marple. The inspector wished to see her at the vicarage without delay. Curious, Miss Marple made her way back through the stalls, her mind turning over the new information. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to show edges sharp and dangerous. At the vicarage, Inspector Larch awaited, his notebook open. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course," she said. "What news?" "We've discovered something in the Hepplewhite garden. A small patch of disturbed soil beneath a rose bush, possibly the site of something buried or hidden." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Have you investigated the soil?" "We took samples. Found traces of a chemical substance, something corrosive, possibly used in gardening, but at concentrations unusual for normal use." "That might explain the residue Myrtle mentioned on the crocus saucer," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Exactly," Larch said. "We're following up on suppliers, deliveries, and anyone who might have had access to the garden recently." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Myrtle Cavendish?" "She remains a person of interest. Her late-night sightings and close proximity to Miss Hepplewhite make her an important witness." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, perhaps a convenient scapegoat." Larch regarded her silently. "I intend to find out," she added firmly. As she left the vicarage, the market, noises seemed distant. The village's familiar rhythms now felt dissonant, the comfortable facades cracked by fear and suspicion. Miss Marple paused beneath the budding branches of an old oak tree, looking up at the tender green leaves trembling in the breeze. The crocus had bloomed late this year, and the truth, she knew, would take just as long to emerge. The morning sun slipped cautiously through the curtains of Myrtle Cavendish's modest cottage on Larkspur Lane. The tiny rooms, usually neat and orderly, felt cramped with the weight of silence and unsaid things. Myrtle sat by the window, fingers tracing the rim of a chipped teacup, her gaze distant as the village outside stirred to life. The knock at the door startled her. She rose slowly, smoothing her apron, and opened it to find Miss Marple standing there, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders and a look of quiet determination in her eyes. "Good morning, Myrtle," Miss Marple said gently. "May I come in?" Myrtle hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. Once inside, Miss Marple took a seat by the worn fireplace while Myrtle settled opposite her, hands folded tightly. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple began, "but I wanted to speak with you about Miss Hepplewhite." Myrtle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know why you're here. Everyone is looking at me as if I have fangs." Miss Marple smiled softly. "I'm not here to judge, Myrtle. I'm here to understand. And sometimes understanding comes from listening." Myrtle's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She was difficult. She demanded perfection, but she was lonely. She pushed people away, including me. Yet I stayed. "Why?" Miss Marple asked. "Because I cared for her," Myrtle admitted. "More than anyone else in that village did." "Even if she didn't always show it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Love, after all, can be complicated." Myrtle glanced at the window, then back. There was someone else. "A man?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "The visitor you mentioned." "Before?" "Yes, he was charming, polite, but there was something dark about him. He came from the city, I think." "Did Miss Hepplewhite trust him?" Myrtle's hands trembled, at first. Then she didn't. She said he was dangerous, that he wanted something she wouldn't give. And did he threaten her? Myrtle swallowed hard. Not with words, but with presence. He made her afraid. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Did she tell you his name? Myrtle shook her head. No, she said I must never say it aloud. Did you see him after the flower show? No, he disappeared the night before the show. Do you know why? Myrtle hesitated. She told me he wanted money. Lots of it, she refused. She said it was over. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did she have the money? Myrtle looked away. I don't know. She kept her finances close, but she was worried. Worried enough to fear for her life? Yes, the silence. Between them was thick. Then Myrtle spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. There was an argument that night. I heard raised voices. Miss Lavinia was furious. She told him to leave. But I don't know what else was said. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the blossoming garden. And you? Did you tell anyone about this man? Myrtle shook her head. No, I was sworn to secrecy. Secrecy can be a heavy burden. Myrtle nodded. It is. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, where Inspector Larch was waiting. I've been speaking with Myrtle Cavendish, she said. There's a man involved. Someone from outside the village? Larch frowned. That complicates matters. Indeed, but it might explain the disturbed soil and the residue we found. Do we have a name? Not yet, Miss Marple replied, but I intend to find out. That evening Miss Marple attended the weekly meeting at the village hall. The room buzzed with whispers and sideways glances as she entered. Many villagers regarded Myrtle with suspicion, but Miss Marple's presence seemed to temper the mood. After the meeting, Penelope Cartwright approached her. Jane, she said quietly, do you really believe Myrtle is innocent? Miss Marple looked at her steadily. I believe the truth is often more complex than guilt or innocence, Penelope sighed. She's been acting strangely avoidant, nervous. Fear can do that, Miss Marple said. But it can also protect. Protect what? Secrets. Secrets that someone might kill to keep, Penelope shivered. As the village settled for the night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, mulling over the day's revelations. The mystery deepened, shadows lengthened, and the crocus outside her window bloomed quietly in the moonlight. Somewhere in Beechwood Cross, the roots of a long-hidden truth were beginning to stir. The sun rose with uncommon brilliance over Beechwood Cross, gilding the thatched roofs and dew-beaded hedgerows in soft gold. But beneath the idyllic calm, unease simmered. The death of Miss Lavinia Hepplewhite, once thought a regrettable accident, now pressed down upon the village like a storm cloud refusing to break. At the High Street post office, tongues wagged with renewed urgency. They say she fell, murmured Mrs. Potter, sorting her stamps with unnecessary vigor. But I've heard whispers bruises that didn't match a fall at all. She had secrets, said Mr. Blythe, not looking up from his copy of the Daily Sketch. That woman always had a locked drawer or two. Locked hearts lead to open graves, added Mrs. Winthrop solemnly, as if quoting from Ecclesiastes, though it was more likely her own poetic flourish. Meanwhile, Miss Marple took her customary walk to the churchyard, ostensibly to check on the state of the elderflowers, but truly to observe. She always believed that villages, like plants, thrived or withered based on the soil in which they were rooted. The soil of Beechwood Cross was now churning with buried resentments. She wasn't surprised to see Penelope Cartwright lingering near the war memorial. Her skirts fluttered slightly in the breeze, and she appeared absorbed in her thoughts. You're up early, Miss Marple said gently. Penelope turned, startled. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you. Quite all right, my dear. A morning walk often helps one sort through things. Penelope's expression shifted, relieved, then wary. I suppose I needed air. I haven't been sleeping much. Understandable, with so much uncertainty. But you were close to Miss Hepplewhite, were you not? Penelope frowned. Not close exactly. I helped her with church affairs, read her post aloud, assisted with ledgers. She liked order and control. That she did, Miss Marple agreed mildly. She made enemies, Penelope added, more to herself than to Miss Marple. The kind you don't see until it's too late. Miss Marple gave her a long, quiet look. Is there someone in particular you're thinking of? Penelope shook her head. No one specific. I just feel something was off that night. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Feelings are often truer than facts. Before Penelope could reply, they heard the crunch of gravel behind them. Inspector Larch was approaching, hands tucked behind his back. Ladies, he greeted, nodding politely. Miss Marple, might I have a word? Penelope excused herself, and Miss Marple followed the inspector across the churchyard to a shaded bench. We've completed our initial search of Miss Hepplewhite's cottage, he said. No signs of forced entry, but there was a small key hidden behind the mantel clock. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Was the corresponding lock found? It was, said Larch, a strong box beneath her bed, mostly old letters and savings bonds. But one item stood out a photograph. Torn, but the face of a man was visible, smiling, well-dressed, urban. Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched instinctively, though she held no needles. That might be the visitor Myrtle spoke of. I think so. We're trying to trace him. No name on the photo, but Myrtle might recognize him. She might, Miss Marple agreed. But whether she say so is another matter. She's frightened. She has reason to be, Larch paused. There's something else. Miss Hepplewhite's will has gone missing. Gone? Miss Marple echoed. It was filed with her solicitor, Mr. Trenery, but he received a call last week, allegedly from Miss Hepplewhite herself, instructing him to hold off on executing the original will and wait for a revised version. Was one ever delivered? No, and the original is now unaccounted for. Miss Marple's brows drew together. Who would benefit from the loss of her last will? That's what we're trying to determine, said Larch. The current standing will, the one previously lodged, left most of her estate to a cousin in Devon, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. But rumor had it she intended to change it. To Myrtle? Possibly, or perhaps Penelope. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Penelope? Why not? She visited often. Helped Miss Hepplewhite with correspondence. Could've. Easily overheard something or taken something. I don't believe she's malicious, said Miss Marple. But desperation makes strange companions of people, Larch nodded grimly. We're looking into it. If you learn anything, I'll let you know, Miss Marple promised. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mr. Trenery, the solicitor, in his narrow office above the greengrocer's. Miss Marple, he said, surprised but not displeased. Come to ask about Lavinia? I have, yes. He offered her a spindly chair and poured weak tea into a chipped cup. She was sharp as a whip, Miss Hepplewhite. Knew the law better than some junior solicitors I've trained. She changed her will recently? She intended to? Told me plainly that someone she didn't say who was pressuring. Her, said she would write a new draft and bring it in personally. And she never did? No, and I didn't press. I assumed she'd changed her mind. Do you remember the voice that phoned you? Miss Marple asked. The one that said to delay the old will? Trenery frowned. It was a woman, low voice. Clip speech? Familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Miss Marple's mind began to hum. Not Miss Hepplewhite herself. No, at least, I don't think so. Would you say it sounded like someone from the village? Possibly, he said slowly. But I'd need to hear it again to be certain. Miss Marple walked home with her thoughts swirling like windblown leaves. That night she sat by the fire with a small notebook in hand, jotting fragments of conversation, bits of overheard gossip, the timelines everyone claimed, and the silences that stretched between facts. She paused when she came to the name of the cousin in Devon. That will had gone missing. But not just any will or will that would have excluded someone in the village. Someone who knew enough to impersonate a voice. Someone who had access. Someone who knew how to make something disappear without being noticed. She stared at the page, then underlined a single word 3 times, opportunity. In the darkness beyond Miss Marple's lace-curtained windows, Beechwood Cross lay quiet. But behind those tidy garden walls and shuttered windows, the village was. Not sleeping. Secrets whispered beneath the surface, long-held grievances, desperate hopes, and the fear that someone among them had turned the page of life for Miss Hepplewhite before she meant it turned. And the crocuses still bloomed late, and strangely vibrant. He stood outside the grocer's, hat in hand, blinking up at the crooked sign that read Blythe & Sons, purveyors of quality goods since 1889. He wore a charcoal-gray overcoat of good material, though the cut was slightly too modern for Beechwood Cross, and he carried a small leather valise that looked well-traveled. Myrtle had been heading to fetch a tin of sardines for the vicar's cat when she caught sight of him. She froze behind the hydrangea bush outside Mrs. Talbot's gate, her heart suddenly skittering like a rabbit in brambles. It was him, the man from Miss Hepplewhite's cottage that evening. He hadn't seen her. She was sure of it. She turned and bolted back the way she'd come, leaving the tin of sardines quite forgotten. The man's name, as it turned out, was Mr. Francis Everleigh, or so he said. He arrived at the Crown and Barrel Inn just after midday and signed the guest book with neat, decisive script. Mrs. Elspeth Twining, who had kept the inn for 17 years and had an instinctive distrust of anyone who requested just hot water and lemon instead of a proper tea, gave him a squint-eyed welcome and an upstairs room that had a view of the church spire and a draught behind the curtains. "Business in the village, sir?" she asked as he pocketed the room key. "Of a personal nature," he replied. "I'm visiting an old friend. Would that be Miss Hepplewhite?" she asked brightly. "Though I'm afraid you're a bit late." He didn't flinch. "Yes, I'd heard. A terrible shame." Elspeth eyed him narrowly as he ascended the stairs. She didn't care for his accent London, certainly, but with something practiced in it, like someone reading for the wireless. She made a mental note to mention it to Miss Marple when next she stopped by for seed cake. Miss Marple, for her part, was enjoying a quiet tea in the garden when Elspeth appeared with news of the stranger. "He's no cousin, I'll wager," Elspeth huffed. "Too smooth by half," but he knew Lavinia. You could see it. Miss Marple laid down her teaspoon. "Did he seem distressed?" "Not distressed, more composed. Like a man who's had time to make peace with a death before it happens." Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly toward the crocuses near the edge of the path, their petals fully open in the afternoon sun. "Thank you, Elspeth. That's very helpful." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. If the man had returned, he was not finished with Beechwood Cross, and Beechwood Cross, she knew, was not finished with him. Inspector Larch arrived at the Crown and Barrel shortly before supper. Mr. Everleigh was seated in the lounge, a whiskey untouched beside him and the local paper folded precisely on his knee. "Mr. Everleigh," Larch said, "may I have a word?" The man looked up. "Of course. You must be with the local constabulary." "I am." Larch remained standing. "You were acquainted with Miss Lavinia Hepplewhite?" Everleigh gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, and yes, I was. Lavinia and I were old friends." "From her days in London? You visited her recently?" "I did," he said calmly, "last Thursday. She'd invited me to stay a night. But when I arrived, she seemed off, nervous, said she wasn't feeling well and asked me to leave before supper. She didn't say why, only that she'd had a fright." Everleigh lifted his glass but didn't drink. "I assumed she was unwell. I left that evening. You didn't mention this to anyone." "I didn't know there was a reason to." He held up his hands. "And frankly, I didn't want to be involved in a small-town scandal." Larch studied him. "And yet you've come back." Everleigh smiled thinly. "To pay my respects. And to settle a few matters." "Such as a letter?" "She wrote to me last month. It mentioned something about altering her will and a piece of family jewelry. She didn't elaborate, but I thought I should follow up. May I see the letter?" Everleigh reached into his valise and produced it. The paper was crisp, the writing unmistakably Lavinia's. A looping hand with emphatic underlines. It spoke vaguely of unfinished business and trust misplaced. Larch read it twice, then folded it slowly. "We'll keep this for the time being." "Of course," Everleigh said smoothly. But Miss Marple would later say he hadn't looked surprised at all. That evening, at the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Reverend Stroud and his wife Edith for a modest supper. The vicar's parsnip soup was as lumpy as ever, but the company was pleasant, and Edith's sponge cake made up for the rest. After the meal, Miss Marple excused herself to the study and ran her finger thoughtfully along the spines of the vicar's books. She paused at famous criminal trials of the 20th century and smiled. Reverend Stroud peered in curiously. "Something on your mind, Miss Marple?" "Just wondering," she said, "how often we see villains coming, and how often we simply convince ourselves they aren't what they seem." Stroud chuckled. "There's a sermon in that." "There's a confession in that," she replied dryly. Later, she stopped at Myrtle Shakespeare's cottage. Myrtle answered the door with reddened eyes and fingers stained from chopping beetroot. Miss Marple, feigning a cough, asked for a cup of something warm, and Myrtle, too polite to refuse, brought her inside. They sat in the tiny parlor while the kettle hummed. "Myrtle," Miss Marple said gently, "the man who came today, you've seen him before, haven't you?" Myrtle's hands tightened around her mug. I don't know what you mean." "You do," said Miss Marple, "and you're frightened. But telling the truth will help far more than hiding it." Myrtle looked down at her lap. "He was there the night Miss Hepplewhite died. I saw him leave, just before the scream. He was angry, his face like thunder. You didn't tell the inspector?" "He said she'd invited him. I thought maybe it was a lover's quarrel." Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. "Thank you, dear. That's very brave of you." "I think he took something," Myrtle whispered, from her desk. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. But she kept a ledger there. Brown leather with a red ribbon. She said it was for safekeeping things that couldn't be trusted to memory. It's gone now." Back in her parlor that night, Miss Marple sat with her notes. Mr. Everleigh was no grieving friend. Of that she was certain. He had come back for something, or to ensure something stayed hidden. And if Lavinia had feared him, had turned him away, despite inviting him in the first place, then she must have known at last who he truly was. Now Miss Marple only had to prove it before the crocuses bloomed their last and spring turned to something darker. Miss Marple rose early on Thursday, as she always did, but there was no joy in her usual morning routine. The delicate click of the teacup against its saucer, the distant cooing of pigeons on the chimney pot, even the neat unfolding of the Daily Chronicle, these were all mechanical, half-hearted acts today. Something was amiss in Beechwood Cross, and her mind refused the comfort of routine. She stared for a long time at the crocuses by her window, lilac white and gold, before quietly setting down her knitting and preparing to pay a visit. Not to the inspector, not yet. There was someone else she needed to see. The clock above the mantel in Miss Hepplewhite's cottage still ticked with an austere rhythm, but the house felt different now. Hollow, stripped of its soul, a faint smell of lavender polish lingered in the sitting room, but it couldn't mask the absence of its former mistress. The air had settled into a kind of hush, as though waiting for secrets to be unearthed. Miss Marple had gained access under the pretense of checking whether the deceased's begonias needed watering. Inspector Larch had nodded her through with barely a glance, having learned by now not to obstruct her gentle inquiries. Her fingers moved across the desk drawers methodically, never disturbing more than necessary. The bottom right drawer, as Myrtle had mentioned, was meant to hold a brown leather ledger. It was indeed empty, but the faint imprint of something rectangular still marked the velvet lining inside, as if a book had sat there undisturbed for a long time before it was removed, likely in haste. She opened the smaller drawer and found stationery, some unopened letters, and a pale blue envelope with a broken seal. The paper inside was crinkled, as though crushed in someone's hand and then smoothed again. The writing was unmistakably Lavinia's. "If anything should happen to me, I beg you to speak to Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead. She will understand, and she will know what to look for." There was no name, no recipient written on the envelope, no address. Just the note, folded. Carefully, Miss Marple replaced the letter and stood, lips pursed. Lavinia had feared something specific, something tied not just to her guest, but to a history long buried. and Miss Marple's instincts told her that the missing ledger would contain far more than garden accounts and charitable donations. At the Crown and Barrel that same afternoon, Inspector Larch sat across from Mr. Everly, watching him peel an orange with surgical precision. Larch had always mistrusted neatness in men who weren't surgeons or butlers. It spoke of control and secrets. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Everly," he said, sliding a document across the table. "We found Miss Hepplewhite's updated will. Your name was not among the beneficiaries." Everly did not so much as blink, nor did I expect it to be. "Yet you've returned," Larch said, "and you've inquired about a missing piece of jewelry." "Of sentimental value," Everly replied, dabbing the corners of his mouth with a napkin. "Nothing more." "You had a disagreement with Miss Hepplewhite the evening you visited. A witness saw you leave," angrily. Everly's face hardened subtly, as if steel had slid behind the flesh. "We spoke. I was disappointed in her judgment, that is all." "What did you argue about?" Everly leaned back. "A loan. Years ago, she had promised to repay it with interest. She said she'd made arrangements. But when I arrived, she'd changed her mind." Larch raised a brow. "So you came to collect a debt?" "She invited me," he said smoothly. I merely answered, "You took something from her desk?" Everly's eyes narrowed slightly. "I did not." Larch stood. "The ledger is missing." "And it's not a piece of fiction, Mr. Everly. The lady kept records." "And you imagine they implicate me in some fashion?" Everly chuckled dryly. "Do you mean to arrest me for poor taste in acquaintances?" "No," Larch said slowly. "But I imagine Miss Marple will be rather more imaginative." That, at last, produced a flicker of uncertainty in Everly's eyes. Miss Marple's next visit was to Father Wetherill, the elderly priest who had retired from parish duties, but still offered quiet counsel to those too ashamed or too frightened to speak aloud. His garden was filled with snowdrops, and he wore a cardigan so patched it resembled a quilt. "Ah, Jane," he said, pouring her tea, "I sensed you'd come." "Father," she began gently, "did Lavinia Hepplewhite ever speak to you?" "Of regret?" He looked at her a long moment. "She came last December, on a very cold afternoon." "And?" "She said she had watched someone rot from the inside out, and that she had helped them do it." Miss Marple's hands stilled. "She said she was ready to set things right," the priest went on. "But she feared that doing so would hurt someone who was entirely innocent." "Did she mention a name?" He shook his head. "No, but she asked whether guilt carried on in the blood. I told her it does not." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. "She was preparing to tell the truth, wasn't she?" "I believe so." "But she died first." That evening, Miss Marple sat with her own ledger, a crisp notebook filled with names, timelines, and fragments of overheard conversations. The pieces were beginning to align. Francis Everly was not merely an old friend. He had once been Lavinia's solicitor. Not a very good one, by all accounts, but involved in some capacity in her business affairs in London. His name had been quietly removed from several charitable boards around 1936, and that was the year, Miss Marple recalled, that Lavinia had suddenly returned to Beechwood Cross alone, with a tidy inheritance and no explanation. It was also the year poor Emma Folwell had vanished from the home for young women, and the year the Ashburton Trust scandal had quietly collapsed without charges. Could Lavinia have known? Could she have benefited? And then guilt growing quietly, like mildew in a sealed room. The sense that she had been complicit, that she had bought her peace at another's cost. The ledger would have documented it all, names, sums, transactions that never should have happened. Miss Marple tapped her pen on the margin beside Everly's name. He had come not to mourn, but to retrieve or to erase. And someone else knew it. At 9:10, a note arrived by hand. It had been slipped beneath the garden gate, unsigned. "I know where the ledger is, but I'm afraid. I can't trust the police. Meet me tomorrow after evensong." At the War Memorial, alone, Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beneath the sugar bowl. She looked out into the garden, where the crocuses trembled lightly in the night wind. There were two kinds of secrets in the world, The kind that destroyed you when you told them, and the kind that destroyed you when you didn't, and by this time tomorrow someone would be forced to choose. Evensong at St. Cuthbert's Church drew to a close with the final solemn cadence of the organ echoing in the cold stone nave. A few faithful congregants shuffled down the aisle, Mrs. Palfrey with her stiff knees, old Mr. Archer grumbling about the draft. And the Reverend Soames offered his customary parting nods before extinguishing the altar candles one by one. Miss Marple remained seated at the far left pew, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was serene, but her mind worked furiously beneath the surface like a well-tuned clock mechanism. She had arrived early, as was her habit, and kept a quiet watch on who entered, who lingered, and who whispered to whom. She noted that Myrtle Clegg had not attended, though Myrtle rarely missed a Thursday evensong. Nor had young Elspeth Hartley, whose presence lately had become conspicuously absent since the inquest. And Frances Everleigh, too, was nowhere in sight. Miss Marple rose slowly as the last of the candles flickered out. Her steps made only the faintest echo as she crossed the nave and slipped out through the side door. Outside, the village lay cloaked in soft twilight. The War Memorial and aging stone obelisk bearing the names of 37 fallen sons stood across the green, its base ringed by yellowing daffodils and crocuses barely awake under the evening chill. She walked toward it unhurriedly, pausing once to adjust the silk scarf around her neck. There was no one there, at least not immediately visible. Then, from behind the monument, a figure emerged, small, nervous, and wrapped in a green mackintosh too large for her slender frame. "Elspeth," Miss Marple said softly, the girl startled. "Oh, you came. I wasn't sure if you would. I try never to disappoint those who leave anonymous notes at my gate," Miss Marple said kindly, though there was no jest in her eyes. "Why the secrecy, my dear?" Elspeth's hands twisted at the buttons of her coat. "I don't know who to trust. The police inspector Larch, he's kind, I suppose, but he doesn't understand. And I can't talk to Myrtle. She only runs straight to Mr. Everleigh. So you do know Mr. Everleigh?" Elspeth hesitated. "Yes, I saw him at the cottage that evening. The night Miss Hepplewhite died, Miss Marple waited. I was going to return a book," Elspeth continued, "one she'd lent me about gardening. But when I got near the house, I saw him leave. He was carrying something wrapped in a handkerchief or cloth. It looked square heavy. Was he alone?" Elspeth nodded. "I think so, but he looked upset, angry, and then later, when I heard she had died," her voice caught, "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "That they'd think I had something to do with it, or that he'd come after me." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "You mentioned in your note that you knew where the ledger was." Elspeth looked over her shoulder. "It's in the church." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "The sacristy. Miss Hepplewhite gave it to me the week before she died. She said it was very important and that I should hide it somewhere no one would think to look, but where God might still see it." She gave a tremulous smile. "That sounded like her, didn't it?" "Indeed it does," Miss Marple murmured. She was rather fond of her dramatic metaphors. "I put it behind the vestry cabinet. There's a little recess there where the wall dips in. It's dusty, but dry. Shall we retrieve it now?" Elspeth hesitated. I think you should go alone. I can't bear to touch it again. Reading it was horrible. There were names, amounts, dates, people I know." Miss Marple touched the girl's arm lightly. "You've been very brave, Elspeth. You've done the right thing." The church was still unlocked. The Reverend Soames often forgot to bolt the sacristy door until his evening tea had cooled. Miss Marple moved quietly through the dim interior, her steps soundless on the flagstones. The vestry cabinet was a tall walnut thing, faded from years of polish. She crouched carefully and reached behind it, her fingers brushing dust and plaster until they met the firm edge of leather. The ledger, she withdrew it with care. It was heavier than expected, bound in dark cracked hide with a clasp long rusted shut, but a small blade from her handbag made quick work of the clasp. She opened it on the cabinet top, tilting it toward the lamplight. The contents were worse than she feared. The first few pages were ordinary enough donations to the Women's League, gardening invoices, small domestic expenses. But further in, the entries became darker, more precise. Loan to Effie for consolidation, £2,800 under agreed silent terms. Payout from Ashburton, £3,100 redirected via EF to LH, avoid direct banking. Note: remove Emma Folwell from register place through back channel, FE to arrange. Miss Marple's breath caught. She closed the book softly. Names and initials, codes of complicity. Lavinia had kept it all, not just financial records but a map of betrayal. And at the center, Frances Everly, and one more name. Emma Folwell? A name absent from village conversation but etched here, with disturbing regularity. So that was it. Lavinia had, long ago, chosen silence. But the guilt had never left her. And when she finally decided to expose the truth, it had been too late. Everly had returned to collect, to suppress, or perhaps to punish. She tucked the ledger into her bag and turned to leave only to hear the soft scuff of a footstep in the nave. She froze, another step. Then the figure stepped in to view Myrtle Clegg, her expression hard and unreadable in the half-light. "I thought you might come here," Myrtle said. Her voice was low, tense. "I beg your pardon?" "Miss Marple," replied evenly. Myrtle stepped closer. "Elspeth told me you were asking questions about the ledger, about Mr. Everly." "And how would you know Elspeth told me anything?" "Because I told her not to." Myrtle's mouth tightened. "She's a fool. She doesn't understand what this means." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "What does it mean?" "Myrtle? It means," Myrtle said, voice rising, "that you can ruin everything, for all of us. That ledger, it's poison. It drags up things we buried years ago, things we had to bury." Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. "Such as the disappearance of Emma Folwell?" Myrtle's face went pale. "Or perhaps Lavinia's inheritance. The one that came too conveniently after the collapse of the Ashburton Trust." "You don't understand," Myrtle hissed. "People were desperate. He offered us a way out. Mr. Everly?" Myrtle didn't reply. Miss Marple nodded. Sadly, Lavinia tried to right a wrong. She entrusted the truth to Elspeth perhaps because she still believed some good could come of it. But you— "I never hurt anyone," Myrtle interrupted. "Not like him. I only kept quiet." "And silence, Myrtle, as I'm sure you know," Miss Marple said softly, "can be as dangerous as action." That night, Miss Marple locked the ledger in her writing desk drawer and sat down with a fresh page of notes. The list of names was longer now, each one circled with care, each motive a little more distinct. There was still one piece missing. Who had killed Lavinia? She was closer to the truth, yes, but something still didn't fit. Guilt, fear, greed, they had all played their roles. But there was another thread running quietly beneath it all. Something smaller, more intimate. And it would be that thread, Miss Marple knew, that would ultimately unravel the whole. The morning following Inspector Larch's quiet visit to Ivy Grange dawned with a deceptive tranquility. The crocuses trembled gently under the touch of a breeze, as if whispering secrets among themselves. The town of Beechwood Cross might have resumed its rituals, kettles boiling, windows polished, postmen whistling, but beneath it all was a thickening tension, like spring air before a storm. Miss Marple sat quietly at the window of her drawing room, her knitting needles moving in calm rhythm. Yet her thoughts were far from the baby's booties she was constructing for a niece's child in Sussex. Instead, she was mentally sorting facts, inconsistencies, and human behavior, which never failed to speak volumes when one knew how to listen. She had just begun turning a heel when a knock sounded. It was the vicar's wife, Margaret Clement, a woman of brisk steps and brisker opinions, clutching her handbag like a shield. "Jane, forgive the intrusion, but I had the most peculiar encounter just now. I do think you should hear it." Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. "Do sit down, Margaret. What sort of encounter?" "It's Myrtle," Margaret said breathlessly. She was wandering along the edge of the woods beyond the rectory, of all places looking white as chalk. I thought she might have been sleepwalking. When I called to her, she flinched and ran off toward the high street. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The woods by the rectory? That's not a path Myrtle normally takes. No, indeed. And what's more, she dropped this. Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a leather glove. I picked it up after she fled. Jane, it's not hers. It's a man's glove. Miss Marple took it delicately. The leather was dark brown, slightly worn, with a faintly embossed RC inside the wrist seam. The initials meant nothing to her yet, but her interest sharpened. Where exactly did she drop it? Just at the edge of the brambles. It looked as if she'd been digging or searching for something in the soil. There was mud under her nails, I noticed. Miss Marple gave a small nod. How odd. Myrtle, who prides herself on her hands. And there was a thermos left behind lukewarm tea inside. As if someone had been there for hours, waiting. Miss Marple's eyes glittered with a kind of quiet alarm. Thank you, Margaret. You've done a great deal more than you realize. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was in the woods herself. She brought no thermos, no gloves, just her walking stick and a keenly attentive mind. The soil where Myrtle had stood was soft and scuffed. The brambles nearby had a trail beaten into them, recent and hurried. Miss Marple bent carefully and brushed aside a clump of moss. A tiny scrap of cotton blue with a white stripe clung to a thorn, from a man's shirt most likely. She straightened slowly. Someone is hiding something here, she murmured to herself. And perhaps someone else is desperately trying to find it? That evening, the village's social currents again gathered in the drawing room of the Cartwrights, where a bridge night had been planned before the tragedy and could not be easily unplanned without causing gossip. Miss Marple, knitting now stowed in her handbag, watched the room as unobtrusively as ever. Lavinia Hepplewhite's absence hung like fog. Yet the conversation had begun to creep back toward the mundane bake sales, spring coats, minor ailments. It was Eleanor Prowse, always too eager to be helpful, who brought it up again. Such a frightful thing, poor Lavinia. And Myrtle, of course, must be beside herself. Though one does hear she was rather dependent. She was devoted, Penelope Cartwright replied, a little sharply. Mrs. Sims of the post office sniffed. Devotion doesn't mean innocence. I've heard she stood to inherit quite a bit. Miss Marple raised her eyes, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that villagers say far more when not directly interrupted. Still, said Major Appleton from across the bridge table, if anyone benefits from Lavinia's death, we ought to be asking who had debts. That did seem to quiet the room for a moment. Then Penelope asked, Do you mean Myrtle? The Major shook his head. Not particularly. Though I'd say there are several people in Beechwood Cross who wouldn't mind a bit of inheritance, especially after all the stock market jitters in March. Miss Marple leaned toward the fire. Funny, isn't it? She said mildly, how money makes people do things they would never have imagined themselves capable of. Silence followed. Then a clatter. Penelope had dropped her teacup. Goodness, she laughed shakily. Butterfingers. So sorry. That night, Miss Marple was not yet ready to return home. Something urged her instead toward Ivy Grange, where Myrtle had retreated after her curious morning wandering. The cottage windows glowed faintly from within. Myrtle answered the door looking pale, her eyes rimmed with red. Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting anyone. I hope I'm not intruding. But I wondered if you'd mind some company. Myrtle looked like she might say no, then stepped aside. I've made tea, though it's gone cold. That won't matter. They sat in silence a moment before Miss Marple spoke gently. Myrtle, dear, do you know anyone with the initials R? See, the effect was immediate. Myrtle stiffened, her mouth opening then closing as though unsure whether to lie or flee. No, she said too quickly. Should I? Miss Marple reached slowly into her handbag and withdrew the glove. This was found where you were seen this morning. Myrtle looked at it for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she crumbled. It was his, she whispered. The man from London. Do you know his name? Not the real one. He called himself Richard Collins, but that's not who he was. I think Lavinia knew. She knew he was dangerous. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Myrtle's. You've done nothing wrong in telling the truth. But if you continue to hide things, you may become the next victim, if not of the killer, then of the court of public opinion." Myrtle's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I didn't kill her, I only wanted to help." Miss Marple sat quietly as Myrtle wept, her gaze distant. Outside, a crocus shivered in the wind. Beechwood Cross seemed to hold its breath that Friday morning, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Marple, ever observant, felt it in the hesitant footsteps of villagers on the high street and in the muffled tones behind closed curtains. The crocuses outside her window had bloomed fully now, their fragile petals brave against the lingering chill, but the promise of spring felt far from fulfilled. Miss Marple busied herself with her errands, but found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Myrtle and the glove-marked R.C. The name Richard Collins, whether real or assumed, was a loose thread she intended to pull. Yet it was not just the man's identity she pondered, but the deeper undercurrents beneath Lavinia's death, the betrayals buried so carefully, and the heavy toll they exacted. The morning was still young when Miss Marple paid a visit to the village's oldest resident, Mrs. Agatha Peneligon. The elderly widow's cottage stood at the far end of Beechwood Cross, its stone walls covered in ivy and its garden an unruly sprawl of herbs and wildflowers. Mrs. Peneligon, with a sharp eye that belied her years, welcomed Miss Marple warmly. "I heard the news, dear." "Tragic about Lavinia, such a sweet lady." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, Agatha, but sometimes sweet faces hide bitter tales. I wonder if you might help me with a question about a certain Mr. Richard Collins." Mrs. Peneligon's eyes flickered. "That name takes me back a good many years, Jane. He was a solicitor once, or claimed to be. Came to Beechwood Cross for a brief spell before the war, but didn't stay long. Do you remember much about him?" The old woman settled into her armchair, fingers interlaced. "He was charming, that one. Too charming for his own good. There were whispers, people said he had a knack for persuading widows and gentlefolk to part with their fortunes. But no one ever had proof, just shadows." "Did he have any connection to Lavinia Hepplewhite?" Agatha's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Lavinia was a proud woman, but Richard Collins, he was the sort of man who could make you think you owed him your soul." "They knew each other, yes. More than just acquaintances, perhaps," Miss Marple pressed further. "Did you ever hear of any scandal involving him?" "Ah," said Mrs. Peneligon, "that's where the whispers grow loud. A failed business deal, some missing money, and a disappearance that left many broken-hearted. I think I heard something about a woman named Emma Folwell in that tale." "Emma Folwell." The name circled back to Miss Marple's mind, tying the threads of the ledger and village secrets more tightly. That afternoon Miss Marple took a slow walk down the lane to the village shop, where she found Elspeth Hartley behind the counter, arranging fresh flowers. "Elspeth," Miss Marple began, "I wonder if you might spare a moment. There is something more I'd like to understand about that ledger." Elspeth nodded, her pale eyes showing the strain of recent days. "I'm still so confused, Miss Marple. I don't understand why Lavinia kept it hidden or why she would fear Mr. Collins." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Secrets, dear, often have their own lives, growing larger and more tangled the longer they are hidden. What matters now is to unravel them carefully." They spoke quietly of the ledger's entries, of sums of money transferred discreetly, and of names marked with caution. Elspeth recalled Lavinia's fear, her hushed warnings about people who were not what they seemed. Miss Marple listened with a growing conviction. The ledger was a map, not just of money, but of betrayal, loyalty, and fear. It was a testament to a past that refused to stay buried. Later that evening, Miss Marple met with Inspector Larch in the little police office above the station. The inspector was weary but resolute. "Jane," he said, using the familiarity they had developed, "we've been checking on Richard Collins, or whoever he really was. No trace in London or any other town. It's as if he vanished." Miss Marple considered this. People who want to disappear often find ways. "Indeed, but it complicates matters. We have suspicions, but no solid proof. And the ledger, well, it's been missing since your last visit to the sacristy." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's a dangerous document. Larch sighed. And we've had a report from Elspeth Hartley. She says Myrtle Clegg has been acting strangely, avoiding people, looking anxious. The glove you mentioned. We found the other one hidden in Myrtle's cupboard. The revelation was chilling. Myrtle's involvement deepened the mystery, and the pieces began to suggest a story more complicated than any single motive. Jane, Larch said carefully, do you think Myrtle knows more than she's saying? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Oh, I'm quite sure of it, Inspector. But the truth is often wrapped in layers of fear and protection. That night, as the village settled under a star-strewn sky, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her notebook and the worn leather ledger carefully tucked away. She made note of names, dates, and connections, Lavinia's cautious generosity, Everleigh's calculated returns, Myrtle's silence, and Elspeth's courage. Her thoughts drifted to the crocuses outside, the flowers that had bloomed late but refused to wither, standing firm against the cold. Like them, the truth would emerge, no matter how deeply hidden or how long it took. And Miss Marple was resolved to see it through. The early morning mist still clung to Beechwood Cross as Miss Marple made her way toward the small railway station on the village outskirts. The soft rustle of crocuses in the spring breeze mingled with the distant whistle of a train approaching, a sound both familiar and oddly unsettling in the shadow of recent events. The station platform, usually deserted at this hour, bore signs of recent disturbance, a scuffed patch of gravel, a discarded matchbox near the waiting bench, and a single leather glove much like the one Margaret Clement had found in the woods, but this one unmistakably worn and weathered. Miss Marple crouched down to examine the glove, noting its worn seams and a faint monogram on the inside cuff, R.C. The initials pressed anew a puzzle she'd been turning over for days. A figure emerged from the station office, a man tall, with a weather-beaten face and a tired gait. He paused, startled to see her crouched beside the glove. Miss Marple? His voice was rough but carried an edge of relief. Yes, Mr. Collins, she replied calmly, rising to face him. He nodded slowly, as though weighing the gravity of her presence. I suppose you have questions. Several, she said, eyes steady. I'm curious why you left the glove here, of all places. He smiled wryly. Careless, I admit. But perhaps it was fate. I wanted you to find it. Why? Miss Marple asked. You've been a ghost in Beechwood Cross for years. Why appear now? Collins glanced down at the ground, fingers twitching. Because the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you run. And because Miss Hepplewhite deserved better than the silence she got. Miss Marple considered this. You knew Lavinia? More than I cared to admit, his voice dropped. We had a history, a complicated one. I was involved in matters that put her in danger. Danger of what kind? He looked away. Old debts, failed promises, and people who prefer their secrets buried. I came back to make amends, but found the village already tangled in. A web I helped weave. Miss Marple's mind raced. What about the ledger, the money? The missing Emma Folwell? Collins swallowed hard. Emma was, a casualty of our recklessness. Lavinia tried to protect her by covering it up, but the truth leaks out eventually. Who else knew? Enough to make enemies, he said bitterly, and enough to make murder inevitable. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You're saying Lavinia's death was no accident? He nodded. She wanted to expose the truth, but someone else wanted silence. Do you know who? Collins hesitated, then whispered, Look to those closest to her. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from where we least expect. As the train's whistle echoed closer, Collins stepped back toward the office door. I can't stay, but I trust you'll find the rest of the story. Miss Marple watched him go, clutching the glove tightly. The crocuses outside seemed to lean toward the platform as if eager to witness the final revelation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green, where the war memorial stood quietly amidst the awakening crocuses. Beechwood Cross felt both wary and expectant, as though the truth hovered just beyond the horizon, waiting for a breath to release it. Miss Marple sat in her drawing room, the leather-bound ledger open before her on the polished table. Her fingers, traced the entries slowly, as if willing the faded ink to reveal more than just numbers and names. The room was silent save for the ticking of the old clock and the occasional creak of settling timber. Outside, a light rain began to fall, drumming softly against the window pane. It was a sound that suited the mood, gentle, persistent, and cleansing. Earlier that morning, Miss Marple had invited several key villagers for tea, a gathering both casual and purposeful. The Cartwrights, Eleanor Prowse, Myrtle Clegg, Elspeth Hartley, and even Inspector Larch had accepted, each bringing with them a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. As they settled around the fire, Miss Marple spoke gently but firmly. "We have all been touched by recent events in this village. It is only right that we seek to understand what truly happened to Lavinia Hepplewhite." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Myrtle shifted in her seat, her hands clasped tightly. Elspeth looked pale but resolute. Inspector Larch, ever professional, maintained a neutral expression, though his eyes flickered with interest. Miss Marple continued, "Lavinia was a woman of great courage, who kept a ledger, one that told a story of debts, secrets, and betrayal. We have learned that several among us were entangled in these affairs, whether knowingly or unwittingly." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But there is one final thread of truth hidden beneath the surface that must be drawn out." The room fell silent. Then Eleanor Prowse spoke hesitantly. "I don't understand. Who among us had reason to kill Lavinia?" Miss Marple's eyes met hers steadily. "Myrtle, do you recall the night Lavinia died? You were seen near the woods, distressed and unsettled." Myrtle swallowed hard. I only wanted to help. I didn't kill her." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But your silence and the secrets you've kept have shaped much of what we now face." Elspeth nodded, adding, "The ledger implicated more than just debts. There were threats, warnings to keep quiet, and people who feared exposure." Inspector Larch cleared his throat. "We have evidence that someone tampered with the sacristy after Lavinia's death, attempting to remove the ledger." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "Exactly. And the man with the initials RC, Richard Collins, was no mere visitor. His past involved manipulations that reached into Beechwood Cross long ago, but his return was not to harm. He sought to make amends." She turned to Myrtle. "You mentioned the man from London who was dangerous. Do you believe he could be involved?" Myrtle hesitated, then whispered, "No, he wanted the truth. But someone else was protecting secrets more selfishly." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. The ledger's final entry bears a note: 'Trust none but the innocent.' It is a paradox, but one that leads us to reconsider who among us bears true guilt." As the rain continued to fall, Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the greatest betrayals come not from strangers, but from those closest to us, those we trust." She faced the group again. "There is one person whose actions do not align with their words. A person who had much to lose and little to gain from Lavinia's death." A hush fell. The tension was palpable. Miss Marple looked directly at Eleanor Prowse. "You have been outspoken about your loyalty to the village and its moral fabric, yet your interest in the Hepplewhite estate was hardly selfless." Eleanor's cheeks flushed. "That's absurd," Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps. But consider this. Who benefited most from the absence of Lavinia? Who stood to gain from the destruction of evidence, the silence of witnesses?" The firelight flickered across Eleanor's face, revealing a flash of something fear, defiance, before she composed herself. "I deny any wrongdoing," Eleanor said, voice steady but strained. Inspector Larch stepped forward. "We will conduct a full investigation. But Miss Marple's observations must be taken seriously." The guests departed one by one, leaving Miss Marple alone with the ledger and the growing dusk. She sat and reflected on the tangled web: money, fear, loyalty, and betrayal. Her thoughts returned to the crocuses, those fragile blooms that had blossomed late but resiliently. They symbolized more than just the arrival of spring. They were a testament to persistence, to truth breaking through the coldest earth. "Missa." Marple reached for her pen, writing a final note. Innocence is not always apparent. The key lies in the small truths overlooked by those blinded by greater deceptions. She looked up, her eyes sharp and clear. Tomorrow would bring answers. The final thread was within reach. The morning after the tea-gathering dawned pale and cold. A thin mist hung low over Beechwood Cross, veiling the thatched rooftops and the freshly sprouting crocuses that clung to the dew-slicked earth. It was Sunday once again. The bells of St. Mildred's chimed faintly in the distance, calling the faithful and the curious alike to service. Miss Marple arrived just before 10. Bundled in a dark gray coat, her eyes alert beneath the brim of a modest cloche hat. She was not a particularly pious woman, but she had long learned that churches, like parlors, were excellent places for observing human nature, particularly after scandal had shaken a village to its roots. Inside the church, the air was heavy, with incense and whispered speculation. Eleanor Prowse sat at the far end of the pews, her back ramrod straight, chin high. Myrtle Clegg sat nervously beside Elspeth Hartley, both women tense as drawn wires. Inspector Larch lingered near the entrance, speaking quietly with the vicar. The service passed with little attention paid to the sermon. It was afterward in the vicarage hall over tea and seed cake that Miss Marple quietly stepped forward. "If I may," she said with a kindly smile, "I believe we are all owed a gentle unraveling. It is not justice that demands explanation, but peace." There was a murmur of agreement. No one moved to leave. Miss Marple turned toward Inspector Larch. "You asked me, some days ago, whether I thought the death of Lavinia Hepplewhite was the result of impulsive violence or premeditated calculation. I believe now it was neither. It was fear." She glanced at Eleanor. "Miss Prowse, you have long held this village in the palm of your hand through charity, tradition, and influence. But your greatest weapon has always been knowledge. You knew everyone's secrets, and you used them as currency." "That is slander," Eleanor said tightly. "No, merely truth spoken plainly," Miss Marple said, voice as gentle as ever. "You saw Lavinia's ledger not as a threat at first, but as a useful archive. You knew it existed, but something changed. She started copying it over," Elspeth said quietly, eyes wide. "Lavinia told me she was rewriting it to send to someone." "Said she was done protecting people?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Lavinia intended to send a copy to Richard Collins. Not because he was blackmailing her, but because she believed he could help right past wrongs. Particularly the injustice done to his sister, Agnes, long ago." The room stilled. Eleanor's jaw clenched. "That was never proved." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you were part of the campaign that drove Agnes out." "The letter writing, the insinuations, the accusations whispered at teas. Lavinia in her youth took part too. She told me so. But with time she changed, saw it as the cowardice it was." Myrtle spoke next, trembling. "So, Eleanor, you thought Lavinia would expose it all?" "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "Not just the village's secrets, but her own." "Regret in yours, Miss Prowse?" "Because in that ledger, and in the letter she began to draft, were names, yours included." "You were never as distant from the old scandal as you claimed." Eleanor stood. "You think I killed her?" "Over something." "That happened 20 years ago?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "You silenced her not out of hatred, but panic. You went to the sacristy late that night? I expect you meant only to take the ledger, but Lavinia confronted you." Inspector Larch stepped forward. "There were 2 teacups found there. One bore faint traces of barbiturate prescription sedatives, often misused. You must have offered her something to calm her nerves." "I didn't," Eleanor began, then stopped. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "No one meant for it to happen. You thought it would simply put her to sleep. But Lavinia was frailer than you knew. Her heart couldn't take it." The room was silent. Then Eleanor whispered she forgave me. Before she slipped away, she said we were both cowards once. There were tears in her eyes now, though whether they came from guilt or sorrow, Miss Marple could not say. Larch moved forward and gently placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. "You'll need to come with me." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The crocuses, despite the chill, stood proud in little violet and white clusters near the edge of the path. She knelt, fingers brushing the petals. So late to bloom, yet here they were, undeterred by the frost, stubborn in their beauty. Nature's lesson, she supposed. Truth, like spring, comes in its own time. Elspeth Hartley joined her, bearing 2 steaming mugs of tea. She's gone quietly, sighed she couldn't fight any longer. Miss Marple took the tea with thanks. It's not always the loudest who do the greatest harm, Elspeth. Often it's the respectable ones, those who use propriety as a shield. And Lavinia? She knew the truth, Miss Marple said. She was tired of hiding. But perhaps she knew too that her actions, those few quiet efforts, would be enough. They sipped in silence for a time. Then Elspeth asked, "Do you think people will forgive her for keeping so many secrets?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, people forget in time. But forgiveness, that is something else. That takes courage. The kind that blooms late, like a crocus pushing through winter soil." The end.